Since we're all talking about the World Cup, let's talk about how this soccer player was murdered after he lost the game. On June 22nd, 1994, Andres Escobar, who was the captain of Colombia's soccer team, was playing against the US and scored in his own net during the World Cup. Colombia ended up losing the game 2-1 and was eliminated. 10 days later, Andres was confronted by a group of men outside a club in the city of Medellin. These men began harassing Andres and making fun of him for shooting in his own net, and even though he tried to reason with them, they shot him 6 times. The next day, police arrested Humberto Castro Munoz, who was associated with powerful criminals and drug traffickers. It's been said that the criminals that Humberto was working with were betting a lot of money on Colombia to win, and when they lost because of Andres' mistake, then they ordered Humberto to murder him. Humberto was sentenced to 43 years in prison, but only served 11 years before being released for good behavior. More than 120,000 people attended Andres' funeral, and Colombia created a statue of him in 2002.
On November 5, 2014, emergency services were called to a home in West Calhoun Township, Pennsylvania, because someone had reported an unresponsive child. When emergency services arrived, it was clear that they were dealing with something more horrific than just an unresponsive child. Paramedics found the lifeless body of 3-year-old Scott McMillan. Scott was covered in many bruises, lacerations, and puncture wounds. Paramedics quickly rushed Scott to the hospital. As he arrived, just the appearance of Scott and the condition he was in left nurses sobbing. Unfortunately, there was nothing more that could be done for Scott, and he was pronounced dead on arrival. Scott was the son of Jillian Tate. Jillian, along with her boyfriend Gary Fellenbaum, were immediately questioned about Scott's death, and they confessed to the horrors they had inflicted on him. Leading up to the death of Scott, he had been beaten with blunt and sharp objects, whipped and taped to a chair with electrical tape. His head was smashed through a wall, and he had also been hung up by his feet and beaten, which largely contributed to his death. Jillian told investigators that Scott refused to eat his breakfast, and that is why he was beaten. The beatings took place over a course of 3 days, and it was discovered that Scott had been starved over the course of weeks. According to Jillian, she frequently beat Scott as well as his 6-year-old brother. She said that both her and Gary would partake in these beatings and laugh at the boys when they cried. Although the 3 days of torture led to the death of Scott, both him and his brother had been subject to the abuse for much longer. When Scott was found unresponsive, he was on an uninflated air mattress while Jillian and Gary went out shopping. Later, they realized that Scott was still unresponsive, so they put him in a shower for 30 minutes before they decided to call for help. Jillian and Gary were both arrested and charged with the murder of Scott. They had also been charged with aggravated assault and the beating of Scott's brother. The prosecution's office was going to be seeking the death penalty against the couple. Jillian and Gary had met just a month before Scott's death while working together at Walmart. They almost immediately moved in together. The mobile home housed Jillian, Scott, Scott's brother, Gary, Gary's estranged wife Amber, and their 11-month-old daughter. Amber was also charged with child endangerment as she did not attempt to assist Scott. Jillian and Gary were ordered to stand trial, but they attempted to get the trial moved to a different county, claiming that pre-trial publicity would not let them receive a fair trial. Jillian pled guilty to third-degree murder as a part of a plea deal where she would testify against Gary in his upcoming trial. During the hearing, the DA read out a letter that Scott's brother had written him after his brother's murder. The note read, "Dear Mom, in November 2014, you, Gary, and Amber were trapped in a house of torture. The torture was you guys. The victims were me and Scotty. Scotty got killed, I got beaten. You are the worst mother I've ever known. You just watched us get hurt. I wish you never met Gary. He is really evil. He nearly killed me. You are the reason Scott got killed. I thought parents were supposed to protect us. Now you are in jail for your time out." Jillian was sentenced to 42 to 94 years in prison. In September, Gary pled guilty to first-degree murder. He pled guilty as opposed to go to trial to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life without parole. After the trial, the DA read a letter that Scott's brother wrote to Scott. It said, "Dear Scotty, I am so sorry that you got killed by Gary. I was trying to protect you. I have good news and bad news. The good news is Gary is in jail. The bad news is you are in heaven and not with me."
I guess it's time. We talk about one of the most chilling spots in America. This is Bunny Man Bridge. In the early 1900s, there was an insane asylum in Clifton, Virginia. One day, a bus carrying residents of the asylum crashed onto what is now called Bunny Man Bridge. When they crashed, there were 2 escapees. One of those escapees was known to be very dangerous. Police searched the surrounding woods, but they could never find him. And ever since, strange things began happening on the bridge. People reported seeing a man near the bridge in the surrounding woods dressed in a bunny suit. And whenever he appeared, bad things happened. He would run after people, and he was dangerous. Officials believed that this was that escapee, and he became known as the Bunny Man. He was still out there, living in the woods, terrorizing those who came across him and the bridge. According to legend, if you go to the bridge at midnight on Halloween and chant Bunny Man 3 times, he'll appear. But apparently if you do, you're not around long enough to tell the tale, if you catch my drift. You feel me? This is very real. Check out this headline from the Washington Post in 1970. He's been spotted countless times, and many believe the ghost of the Bunny Man is still out there. This notorious spot was featured on the Fox documentary Scariest Places on Earth. Have you ever been to Bunny Man Bridge or worse? Have you seen him?
This is part 1 of what happened with Diane Schuler. On July 26, 2009, Diane Schuler traveled the wrong way for approximately 2 miles on the Taconic State Freeway. She was driving between 75 and 85 miles an hour before colliding head-on with an SUV, killing 8 people in total. But what happened in the hours leading up to the horrific crash? Let's dive in. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on July 26, 2009, 36-year-old Diane Schuler left the Hunter Lake campground in Parksville, New York. She and her family had been on a camping trip there in the trailer that they leave at the campgrounds. She took off in her brother's borrowed 2003 red Windstar minivan. With her, she had her 5-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter. She also had her 3 nieces, ages 8, 7, and 5. Diane's husband Daniel left the campgrounds the same time as Diane and the children. A co-owner of the campground stated that on departure, Diane appeared to be sober, which is an important detail to remember for later. On her way back, they made a pit stop at McDonald's and a Sunoco gas station. Surveillance photos showed Diane arriving at the gas station, entering, and then leaving the gas station. Sound on the surveillance system didn't work, so no conversations were recorded within the station. Diane's husband, sister-in-law, and an investigator working for the family are adamant that there was a conversation with the clerk about buying over-the-counter pain meds, despite there being no record that there was any pain meds sold at the time. At 11 a.m., she left the station and was traveling along Route 17/Interstate 86 and Interstate 87. Several witnesses later stated that they saw a red minivan driving aggressively on the interstate. They reported tailgating, flashing headlights, horn honking, switching lanes, and straddling the lanes. According to a police report, she was seen on the side of the road on her hands and knees as if she had been vomiting. She was seen again in the same position a short time later north of the Rampo-Slatsburg rest stop. Around 1 p.m., a phone call was made to her brother, Warren Hance, from her cell phone. One of his daughters who was in the van reportedly told him that Aunt Diane was having trouble seeing and speaking clearly. Diane then spoke to Warren herself and said that she was disoriented and could not see clearly. Warren told her to stay off the road while he came to get them. He said he tried calling them numerous times, but with no answer. At some point, Diane had left her cell phone on the side of the road, and it was discovered later by another motorist. Head over to part 2. This is part 2 of what happened to Diane Schuler. It is unclear the route that Diane took from the toll bridge to the Taconic State Parkway near Briarcliff Manor. At 1:33 p.m., 2 drivers called 911 after seeing Diane's van heading down the northbound exit. At the end of the ramp, there were clearly marked 2 do not enter signs and 2 one-way signs. A minute later, there were 4 more 911 calls stating that they had seen a minivan driving the wrong way at speeds of approximately 75 to 85 miles an hour down the parkway. The minivan traveled for approximately 2 miles in the passing lane before colliding head-on with a Chevy Trailblazer at 1:35 p.m. at speeds of approximately 75 to 85 miles an hour. The initial crash caused a secondary crash with the Chevy Tracker. 2 men who witnessed the crash ran up to assist the passengers despite the rising smoke. They pulled Diane out and noticed a broken bottle of Absolute vodka next to the driver's seat. They tried to pull the girls out of the wreck, but they noticed that none of them had pulses. Because all of the children ended on top of each other, they did not notice Diane's son, Brian, who had been lodged underneath one of his cousins. Brian was the only survivor from the minivan. Most victims died at the scene. These victims include Diane, her daughter, and two of her nieces, along with 81-year-old Michael Bastardi and his 49-year-old son Guy, and their friend Don Lago, who were all passengers in the Chevy Trailblazer. The two passengers of the Chevy Tracker only had minor injuries. Diane's niece, who survived the initial accident, was taken to an area hospital but passed later that day. Brian suffered broken bones and a severe head injury that left him hospitalized for a little over 2 months. The conclusion was that the cause of the accident was due to intoxication, which Diane's husband has strongly disagreed with. Her official toxicology report showed that her blood alcohol level was 0.19%. She also had 6 grams of alcohol in her stomach that had not been absorbed by her blood at the time. It also stated that she had high levels of THC in her system. Daniel initially said that they didn't drink at the campsite, but then turned around and said that they actually had been drinking, and that they kept an old bottle of vodka in the camper, and that it was possible that Diane had moved it from the camper to the car. Daniel is firm in his belief that his wife suffered from some unknown medical emergency. But after 11 months of testing, New York State Police Department upheld the original toxicology reports. Check the documentary on HBO called There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane. And I'll see you next time.